Well, welcome everybody to CME in Conversation episode 4. I'm really delighted to welcome today my guest, Professor Martin Fautley, who I feel like needs no introduction, but I'm going to ask you, Martin, to introduce yourself anyway.
Thanks, Liz. So I'm Martin Fautley. I'm Emeritus Professor of Education at Birmingham City University. And I have been researching music education since last century, and writing and publishing about it as well, which makes me both very old, but also with a degree of longevity that means I can look backwards, but also look forwards as well, I hope.
Fantastic. That is exactly the kind of perspective that we need. And I know that one of the things that you have looked at a lot is assessment, and that's what we're hoping to talk about today, because as part of Unit 2 of the CME, our learners have to talk about assessment, show us the kind of different assessments that they're doing in the classroom. So I just thought it would be helpful for us to kick off with just kind of a general question about how important you think assessment is in terms of helping students to progress.
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot of things in that question that actually need unpicking. And so I know the standard academic answer is it depends what you mean by. And so it depends what you mean by. I think let's try and unpick them. So I think there's assessment and progression, and there's using assessment for progression, and there's understanding progression. I think one of the things about assessment is there is assessment in the sense that Swanwick, I'm trying to think references off the top of my head, but I can't give you the year and the page number. But I can just say that Swanwick said to teach is to assess about music education. And I think that's really true. And one of the things that I've often said and written about is that I think music teachers are actually very good at assessment, and they're very good particularly at formative assessment. And I think one of the issues for music teachers is unpicking the notion of assessment as formative assessment, as assessment for learning, as assessment, and not just simply, well, I'm responding to what I'm listening to from the children in front of me. And so I think the importance of formative assessment is such that we've done formative assessment in music education, like I say, for donkey's years. And I've often used the sort of joke that Bach and his 96,000 children, they didn't rock up to him and say, hello, Dad, I've been practicing my organ piece. And he said, yes, very good. That's 76%. Next child, please. He'd actually give some feedback and encouragement and talk about what the various children had been doing. And this is something we recognize in music education. I think where it becomes slightly problematic is when we need to unpick some of that assessment terminology and talk about it in a way that makes it visible. And I think making formative assessment visible is actually quite a problem sometimes. And I know somewhere on my desk is a present you bought me, which I can't see at the moment, which is a verbal feedback given stamp. And I sometimes worry that this is how assessment has been reduced to thinking about, I have given them some verbal feedback, I'll stamp their workbook, their music book, their piano book, whatever, and that's it. But I think, and especially for people doing the qualification you're talking about, we need to unpick that a little bit more. So what is the formative assessment that's being done? How is it being done? How is it being conveyed? And then importantly, how is it being evidenced? And so I think there's some important things about evidencing formative assessment, which are quite important and don't necessarily involve just going, like my pathetic Bach joke, that was 76% next, but what we can do. But then that takes us out and into summative assessment, where we're giving grades, marks, levels, numbers, all these other things. And I think that there is a use for that, for thinking about progression. But what I would want to do really, and at the risk of banging on tediously, I think what we really need to think about is having good assessment criteria. And often these are assessment criteria which we have tacitly living in our heads rent-free, but we don't actually explain them. And I think one of the tasks that I think is quite important is to try and make some of these assessment criteria visible. I don't want to do unnecessary plugs for here's one I made earlier, but Ali Dorby and I had a go at doing this for the ISM. And one of the things that I would say is writing the assessment criteria took blooming ages because it's hard. And I think for people in the, busy, active teaching and learning environment, whatever it is, classroom, studio, instrumental, whatever, actually producing these to scale is a big ask. But I do think that we need to think about them. And I think we need to think about them quite carefully. And it worries me a little bit when I see people just say, oh, I've got some from maths and I've just changed a word so that it works for music, because I think we need to be quite specific. Now, how do we help? The other part of your question was about progression. And I think in music education, we have issues with the word progression, because I think it has two meanings. I think it means progression as in getting better, but also in music, particularly music hubs and instrumental work, we talk about progression routes. So we can go from doing this to joining the school recorder ensemble, to the area recorder ensemble, to the hub recorder ensemble, to the county recorder ensemble, whatever. And that's a progression route. Now, obviously, progression is taking place as well. But I think in classroom learning, progression takes place, and progression is something that happens. And there are bits of certain recent government pronouncements that I'm not entirely on side with, but the idea of there being regular input in a music lesson, I think, is something that would help with progression. I think assessment needs disentangling in order to be able to do that. I'm very aware that I've been rattling on for an awfully long time, but I think those are, in essence, the things that I'm thinking about in terms of assessment and progression. But the word you haven't mentioned is, or I haven't mentioned, is development. And maybe we ought to be thinking about assessment for progression and assessment for development as well. So assessment can do an awful lot of things. Before I stop and take breath and have a swig of coffee, one of the things that I do worry about is when teachers say to me, oh, the deputy head wants my spreadsheet on Friday and I haven't got anything on it. And then it's a matter of inventing something to go in a box, which may or may not be meaningful. But then sometimes the spreadsheet production takes over. And music teachers write to me about having to do data drops with what I think are probably too overly frequent. So they're having to assess simply to provide data. So I think there's issues there as well. So as you could tell, I could talk about this for hours, but we haven't got hours because the recording time on the computer will run out. But that's the essence, I think. I hope I've conveyed that as concisely as possible. He says concisely being where he's hardly paused for breath. However, time for a swig of coffee.
No, thank you. You absolutely have. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned development there, because we do tend to talk about progression or progress a lot in education, and as you say, in music education, that's complicated by the fact that sometimes we mean progression routes and sometimes we mean actual children making progress. And of course, it's perfectly possible for a child to make progress in music without ever accessing a progression route. But maybe what we mean by progress really is development, and maybe we should be talking about assessment for development more.
I think, yes, I think this was solidified for me when I was having discussions with American colleagues, particularly American high school colleagues, where, in case people don't know it, in essence, in America, it's band, choir, orchestra as an elective activity, and you elect on a sort of rolling basis to do this. And so one of the things I was talking about with American educators is what progression takes place over time. And this was almost like a foreign question to them, because the repertoire determines what the ensemble will be playing. Now, there is not necessarily a trajectory. I mean, often there is because the kids get older and therefore, but it's to do with moving along a trajectory defined by repertoire. So in essence, I think in the English situation, it's somewhat different for us. And I know the model music curriculum defines curriculum as content, but it has endeavoured to lay out a progression within it in terms of breadth and depth. But in order to progression to happen, I don't think it's just about singing more songs or engaging with more repertoire. I think that's breadth. I think we need to be looking at depth as well. And we ought to be thinking about, well, we're singing this song, not just because it's another song, but because this really helps with breathing. Or this is quite complicated in the fact it's in 2 parts, and they really have to listen. So there's a reason for doing it, other than just, oh, it's another week, we've got to sing another song. So I think thinking about the rationale for that, and those are assessment decisions. So I think it's quite important that we unpick that. What's developing and what's progressing are things that the teacher will know from the kids in front of them. And in some ways, I think that's quite hard to lay out from a distance. And I'm pleased I haven't got that gig. So I think it depends on your kids in your school with your stuff and you. So I think there's a lot to be thought about. But I do think it's important to think about, what is it I want them to learn, and then what are we going to do in order for them to learn this? And so I think those are assessment decisions. A thing I haven't said is I think often assessment arises from curriculum. And so I think we need to think about, what is it we want them to learn? And then we go, what is it we want them to do? Rather than, oh, this is a really good song, let's sing this. Why are you singing it? Because it's a good song. Well, yeah, I mean, that might be perfectly reasonable, but if the only reason to do it is just do more and more, then, and Ofsted something that said that somewhere, didn't they, that simply doing music is not enough, they said. So that those are things I think need disentangling.
Yes, I mean, I mean, no, I do agree with you, but maybe we need assessment to get re-entangled back into the idea of it just being teaching. Because I think sometimes when we talk about assessment, we think it's a separate thing. And as you've articulated, the decisions you are making as a teacher on a daily basis actually are a form of assessment. So maybe we need, I don't know, we need all of that good, useful assessment to go back into under the umbrella of teaching. And then we need another word to describe the stuff that, like you were saying, the spreadsheets and the things that people make you do that aren't actually helping you whatsoever as a teacher.
I was talking to a teacher not long ago, and in their context, they have to do assessment every 4 weeks, which essentially means they have an assessment lesson. Sorry about the air quotes. But I mean, for me, that's a bit of a problem, because if it's every 4 weeks and they get 1 lesson a week, that means 25% of the time is spent on assessment, and it's assessment to generate data. And I think it would be much better if it was entangled and thinking about, what's the progress these children are making, and how can I help? Let's assume it's a class of kids and they're doing something with instruments. How can I help this child here who needs very specific help and maybe just needs to do a fairly simple pattern on the glockenspiel, whereas this child over here has been having flute lessons for a year, they've brought their flute in, they can be doing something different. I don't want to force the flautist to do a simple note pattern on the glockenspiel, and the glockenspiel kid can't play the flute. So there's no point asking them to do that. So it's what do I want them to do in order to be able to progress at their various levels? And again, that's quite a big ask for non-specialist teachers, quite a big ask for specialist music teachers, but it's a really big ask for non-specialists. And music is, in some ways, it's not unique in this. Other subjects have it as well, in that kids, there's a huge variation. And when we used to talk about mixed ability, I've always said every class is a mixed ability class for music. It's not homogenous in the ways that it could be for other subjects. So there's a lot entangled in there as well. Sorry, I'm not making this simple, am I? I'm just everything is complicated.
I think that is perhaps why sometimes our learners struggle a little bit with the assessment section of the CME, because it isn't simple. I think this will lead us on to our second question as well, but this idea of sort of how we can make it useful and relevant and something that actually does help every single child in the class and is not just some kind of box ticking exercise. And I know obviously individual teachers often have very little control over the kind of box ticking exercises that they're made to do, although Ofsted, obviously, in their recent reports have been very clear that they think that music shouldn't be assessed on a whole school assessment schedule for the reasons that you've articulated there. But I just think there will, there will always be a teacher being told to do something somewhere that has absolutely no value for them or their pupils, and they're just going to have to do it in the end. And I, gosh, many years ago now, I remember running a course in London, and I spoke to, excuse me, tail end of my cough. I spoke to a teacher there who was being made to use a specific assessment, sort of online assessment system, the name of which I won't mention, which had preloaded assessment criteria into it that it claimed were based on the national curriculum, but when she looked at it, just bore no relation to anything that she was teaching, and she felt that she was teaching the national curriculum. And the group sort of said, oh gosh, what, like, so how did you get around that? What did you do? And she said, well, when I'm teaching, I keep my own notes about important things that I need to remember. I assess that way. And then once a term, I open the wine and I go onto this system and I just put random numbers in boxes against random children's names, because I know that A, no one's going to look at this. B, if they do look at it, they won't understand what it is. So, and it's no use to me whatsoever. So that's what she did. And I was like, you're a bit of a legend, to be honest. That's amazing. I'm not necessarily going to suggest that to people as, as a system moving forward, but I was like, oh, good on you. So, you were made to do it. You knew it was rubbish. So you've got around it in the best way possible. But for our CME learners, we probably don't want them to be doing stuff that is useless. So my second question is, how do you think music educators like our CME learners, and we've got a variety of learners, we've got instrumental teachers, we've got community musicians, we've got primary specialists and primary non-specialists, we've got class assistants, we've got international teachers as well, either working in international schools or in local schools in countries outside the UK. So we've got a whole range of people. How can all of those different people select the right kind of assessments to actually support their students to do something useful, would you say?
Yeah, I think this, in a way, this goes back to something I was saying before. I think you can look at it from two ends. You can look at, what do I want them to learn and do, devise assessment, or you can do devise assessment and then work backwards, and then let's teach them things that I can then assess later on. And I think for the music teacher, the choice is, which of these am I going to be doing? Shall I devise something to assess and then teach them how to do it and then assess it? Or shall I think, this is what I want them to learn, and then devise an assessment for it? And that's quite a problematic decision. And I think it depends on the stage that they're at. So if we fast forward to Key Stage 4, clearly you've got to work backwards from the assessment. This is the exam they're going to take. I've got to work backwards and teach them things that they will be examined on. Less so at Key Stage 3, less so at Key Stage 2, because there's no external examinations, unless we're talking about graded music exams, in which case you work back from what will they be assessed on and then teach them accordingly. If you're in a classroom at Key Stage 2, you don't have that sort of imperative. Therefore, what do I want them to learn? What do I want them to do? How will I know that they can do it? How do I know that they've learned it? In essence, those very simple questions are what assessment is. How do I know they've learned it? How do I know they can do it? What's the evidence? And what can I do with the evidence? Ofsted have talked about this, and one of the things that I've thought for many years, let's go back last century when I was a school music teacher and technology hadn't been invented. In my classroom, I had microphones stuck on the wall. They're the ones like you see in police dramas now, flat ones. So the kids didn't nick them because they didn't look like microphones. But they were all around the room. And I hate to say this, but I had a cassette recorder. And we recorded everything, absolutely everything. Cassettes were pretty cheap in those days. And I was going to say almost disposable, but I had a cupboard full of cassettes. Everything that the kids did musically was recorded, and then we could listen to it later on, and we did listen to it later on. Nowadays, technology is ubiquitous. I know you're not allowed to take your phone out in schools, but you can get pretty cheap voice recorders. You can record everything. Now that we can record everything, we don't. And so I think that there's a place for thinking about, right, I've got my little MP3 recorder or whatever it is, so that it's not video. I can record everything. We can listen to it. That's my assessment evidence. Now, you don't have to listen to it all back, because I know if you record 6 hours of classroom stuff, you think, well, it's going to take 6 hours to listen to it. But you've got it. And you can, I think all you just need to do is, you know, I taught the class today, and so did a really good performance, or so did a really good composition, and you've got a recording of it. And for me, that's assessment evidence. And I think that the problem that we've had for music is using that display of evidence. And I do remember a teacher who said to me, they had to do a book trawl, and the books had to go to the deputy head or whatever. And she said, we've been doing songwriting. So I didn't do a book trawl. I sent a girl with her guitar off to the deputy head to sing the deputy head her song, because that's what we've been doing, and then got suitably told off afterwards because that's not what the deputy head wanted. They wanted it in a book. Well, how do you convey this girl has written a song, she's rocked up with her guitar, played it to the deputy head? How do you convey that in a book? All you can provide would be the lyrics, which isn't, in essence, what a music lesson's about. So I think we need to think about evidence, then what we do with the evidence, and then in these days of computery stuff, how we store the evidence so that, you know, we can get to it should we need to. But then maybe the hardest job is persuading the powers that be that these recordings are evidence. And just because it's not in an Excel spreadsheet, it's still evidence of musical learning. And so I'm not sure how that will work for the people on your course in terms of evidentiary requirements. But I think if they're thinking about what are the criteria we are using for this evidence of this pupil's work musically, then I think probably, as I say, the biggest thing is persuading the powers that be. And interestingly, Ofsted are not one of these powers that be, because they've said more or less the same things themselves. But I can't remember the phrase, a catalogue of recordings or something. So yeah, I think that's how it can be done. Now, how that works for your guys in practice, I don't know.
Yeah, and I was, excuse me, I was thinking as you were talking as well as about whether there's a difference when you're talking maybe secondary, where you might have one teacher teaching everybody, or only a couple of teachers teaching everyone, and then a primary school where if everybody's just keeping notes on their lessons, then obviously the music subject lead or coordinator has got to be able to talk to an Ofsted inspector about how children are making progress across the curriculum, and for them somebody else's notes is probably not going to be a reliable form of sort of standardization or so and again, as you say, Ofsted have talked about audio and video evidence quite extensively. I often speak to primary schools and they often talk to me about photos, and I've always thought a photo is a fairly useless form of assessment for music because you can't hear a photo. All that shows you is that music took place. I suppose if you were really stretching for some use for a photo, you might be able to go, oh, look, they're gripping the beater correctly or something. You know, it's tricky, isn't it? But for the CME, our learners are supposed to show that they use a range of assessments. And again, depending on their context. So, for example, our instrumental teachers, often it will just be observation because they're in a one-to-one situation or they're in a small group situation where that is manageable. And then perhaps they might have, oh, well, here's the report from when they did their exam. And then we struggle a little bit, and we try to encourage them to think about assessment as not just being a process that is done by the teacher. And that's just made me wonder, you know, what your thoughts are on the value of kind of peer assessment and self-assessment in general as part of the kind of toolkit of the way we assess people in schools.
I think one of the early writers on formative assessment was Sadler, and he said, well, I can't remember the exact quote again. One of the issues is that the pupil comes to hold the same view of quality as the teacher, or words to that effect. And I think in music sometimes the issue of peer and self-assessment is that the pupils have come to regard things with the same view of quality as the teacher. And if they have done that and they're able to comment on it, then I think that's how it's probably most useful to be done, because they understand. And for self-assessment, the same thing is true. Why am I doing it like this? What's going on? So we do need to think about metacognition in the way that, particularly for self-assessment, that the pupils are doing. Otherwise, it becomes a meaningless activity. One of my colleagues used to talk about going to a masterclass when he was at conservatoire, and leading expert on his instrument just said, "Oh yeah, just do it like this." Why is that a problem? And you need it unpicking. I did some work for a music hub, and they said the same thing. Expert players would come in and say, "Just do it like this." It's about violin in this case. "Just do it like this. What's your problem?" Whereas an instrumental music teacher said, "No, move up to fourth position, put your first finger here, then you can play it across the strings. Then the kids understand, rather than just do it like this," to have it unpicked for them. So that requires then the pupil then later, when they meet the same thing, to think, "Ah, that's how I do that." And then they understand themselves. I mean, I appreciate that's quite an advanced example, but in classroom context, a similar thing can happen. If you get example, let's take the examples again of playing the glockenspiel. I don't have a glockenspiel on my desk, by the way, so I can't demonstrate this usefully, but I do have a pencil. So if you've got, here's a glockenspiel, if you've got a kid that goes donk, donk, and the note is entirely dead, and they're not realizing they need to do that in order to let the note ring out, then they haven't grasped the, I mean, they might want it to be dead. Okay, fair enough. Yes, I know that. But in general purposes, if they haven't grasped that, then they haven't got the idea of quality. And whilst we're doing that, the other thing, of course, is that we need, I know it's so obvious, I almost wonder why I'm saying it, but then I have also seen it. The kids need to understand that the musical point is the point of strike, not the point of beginning to move. And again, they need to understand that these things happen in order for them to be able to do it. And that could be a very simple formative assessment that a teacher makes. Look, just let it bounce and then it will sound. Then this is happening. How does that help with peer assessment? Well, once again, a kid's friend could say, "Hey, look, just do it like that." But it depends. The sort of peer assessment I'm less convinced by is when they all play their pieces or whatever, and then the kids write down a grade, and there's nothing other than, yeah. I just worry a bit that sometimes, yeah, I don't like that kid, I'm going, that's my mate, I'm going to give him a good grade. So that's the sort of peer assessment I'm less convinced by.
I think certainly my experience of teaching in primary has been, peer assessment is quite tricky unless you pick a sensible child. I know this particular child will actually give constructive feedback. You get exactly what you say, like people just going, "Oh, it's my mate, so I think it was ace," or they go, "It was good." You're like, "Why?" And they're like, "Because it was good."
Yeah,
Like, okay, that was a good use of 2 minutes of my time. Excellent.
yeah,
But at the same time, I kind of feel like that is important for children's development, to develop a way of giving feedback to people is kind and respectful and stuff, but also their musical development, if they're doing it, if they're really thinking about the music and actually kind of
yeah,
engaging with the process, it's another form of learning, isn't it? Being able to think
yeah,
about how somebody else could make their performance better, as well
yeah.
as how you could make your own performance better, I suppose.
I've been doing a lot of work recently with Birmingham Contemporary Music Group. Recently,
Mm.
so I've been doing it for donkey's years. But we've done a project, or we're doing a project called Listening Magic Composed Primary. And one of the things is that we found was, in some cases, just asking children to describe a piece of music. It doesn't matter what the piece of music is. You just play them a piece of music and ask them to describe it, and do this over time, because it's quite hard for children. They don't. I'm going to sound like the awfully old geezer here. In popular culture, people tend not to describe music. So when they're watching the X Factor or something, you don't get a description. You get, "Yeah, that was great." Whereas if you say, "Yeah, okay, so in the first part, I heard this, and then after a few seconds, the trumpet started," and then describing music isn't something that comes naturally, or that in many cases kids have had examples, practical examples, to be seen of descriptions of music. So actually doing this on an ongoing basis helps kids when they then come to talk about their own music or their peers' music, because they've started to develop language. And I'm not sure if they're developing concepts. I think they have the concepts. I think they have the constructs. What they often lack is the language to go with the constructs in order to describe them. I mean, the classic example is I think most kids can tell when something gets louder, but they might not know crescendo as a term. And so it's separating the language from the construct, you know, it gets louder. If they're able to do this, then we can do all sorts of other things with it. And I, in a way, I'm sort of less bothered about knowing musical words than I am about developing the constructs and the concepts if they lack them. And in many cases, I think they don't lack them. They just haven't isolated them in order to talk about them. So I think there are things in there that will help with, that's a very long way around your question about self and peer assessment via metacognition and all sorts of other stuff. Sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine. And I think this whole discussion has sort of just reiterated for me how closely tied all those different things are together, you know, development, progression, teaching, assessing, peer assessing, self-assessment, the teacher interaction with those different, you know, it's all just teaching, isn't it, at the end of the day? And I think perhaps because we're a practical subject, we're used to doing a lot more formative assessment, aren't we, in the moment than, say, English or history teachers. They tend to be more write it down, I'll take your book in, and I'll give you some kind of judgment and an idea for how you'll improve next time. So maybe because of that, we then overcomplicate because we feel like we should be doing more of the kind of assessment that the other teachers are doing, but actually we don't need to because we're already doing the assessment that's useful for us.
Yes, indeed. And we were doing it before them.
Yeah.
And then they came back and told us we were doing it wrong. And I'm always bothered about that. We were doing it before you. So I think we need to hold on to Swanwick. I've mentioned Swanwick lots of times today, but teaching music musically. I also think assessing music musically. We don't assess music mathematically or geographically or something. So I think we need to be true to the subject in order to be doing it.
Oh, what a great way to finish. Thank you. A very sage and wise little soundbite for the end. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. In fact, I enjoyed it so much that I've now made the connection with the fact that when I smile, my earbud falls out of one ear. So, so next time I may need to sellotape it in. But thank you very much for your time and your wisdom today. Much appreciated.
No, it's been a pleasure digging around in the recesses of my brain for all of these little bits of information that I hope even are just a tiny bit useful for somebody somewhere. Then it's all been worthwhile, Liz.
I'm sure they will be. So if this conversation has piqued your interest in the CME, if you look below the video, you'll find a link to find out what the CME is and how you can get involved with it. And also, if you want to watch more of these conversations, the previous ones or the ones that will be coming up over the course of the year, you can click on subscribe as well, and it'll get sent straight to you in your inbox every time one comes out. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and see you in the next episode.